Section 20 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. William of Wykeham, Part 1. A.D. 1324 to 1404. Gothic architecture. A.D. 1100 to 1400. Church architecture is the only addition which the Middle Ages made to art, but even this fact is remarkable when we consider the barbarism and ignorance of the Teutonic nations in those dark and gloomy times. It is difficult to conceive how it could have arisen except from the stimulus of religious ideas and sentiments, like the vast temples of the Egyptians. The artists who built the hoary and attractive cathedrals and abbey churches which we so much admire are unknown men to us, and yet they were great benefactors. It is probable that they were practical and working architects, like those who built the temples of Greece, who quietly sought to accomplish their ends, not to make pictures, but to make buildings, as economically as they could consistently with the end proposed, which end they always had in view. In this lecture I shall not go back to classic antiquity, nor shall I undertake to enter upon any disquisition on art itself, but simply present the historical developments of the church architecture of the Middle Ages. It is a technical and complicated subject, but I shall try to make myself understood. It suggests, however, great ideas and national developments, and ought to be interesting. The Romans added nothing to the architecture of the Greeks except the arch, and the use of brick and small stones for the materials of their stupendous structures. Now Christianity and the Middle Ages seized the arch and the materials of the Roman architects, and gradually formed from these a new style of architecture. In Roman architecture there was no symbolism, no poetry, nothing to represent consecrated sentiments. It was mundane in its ideas and ends, everything was for utility. The grandest efforts of the Romans were feats of engineering skill, rather than creations inspired by the love of the beautiful. What was beautiful in their edifices was borrowed from the Greeks, what was original was intended to accommodate great multitudes, whether they sought the sports of the amphitheatre or the luxury of the bath. Their temples were small, comparatively, and were Grecian. The first stage in the development of church architecture was reached amid the declining glories of Roman civilization, before the fall of the empire. But the first model of a Christian church was not built until after the imperial persecutions. The early Christians worshipped God in upper chambers, in catacombs, in retired places, where they could not be molested, where they could hide in safety. Their assemblies were small and their meetings unimportant. They did nothing to attract attention. The worshippers were mostly simple-minded, unlettered, plebeian people, with now and then a converted philosopher or centurion or lady of rank. They met for prayer, exhortation, the reading of the Scriptures, the singing of sacred melodies, and mutual support in trying times. They did not want grand edifices. The plainer the place in which they assembled, the better suited it was to their circumstances and necessities. They scarcely needed a rostrum, for the age of sermons had not begun, still less the age of litanies and music and pomps. For such people, in that palmy age of faith and courage, when the seeds of a new religion were planted in danger and tears, when their minds were directed almost entirely to the soul's welfare and future glory, when they loved one another with true Christian disinterestedness, when they stimulated each other's enthusiasm by devotion to a common cause, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, when they were too insignificant to take any social rank, too poor to be of any political account, too ignorant to attract the attention of philosophers. Any place where they would be unmolested and retired was enough. In process of time, when their numbers had increased, and when and wherever they were tolerated, when money began to flow into the treasuries, and especially when some gifted leader, educated perhaps in famous schools, yet who was fervent and eloquent, desired a wider field for usefulness, then church edifices became necessary. This original church was modeled after the ancient basilica, or hall of justice or of commerce. At one end was an elevated tribunal, and back of this what was called the apsis, a rounded space with arched roof. The whole was railed off or separated from the auditory, and was reserved for the clergy, who in the 4th century had become a class. The apsis had no window, was vaulted, and its walls were covered with figures of Christ and of the saints, or of eminent Christians who, in later times, were canonized by the popes. Between the apsis and the auditory, called the nave, was the altar, for by this time the Church was borrowing names and emblems from the Jews and the old religions. From the apsis to the extremity of the other end of the building were 2 rows of pillars supporting an upper wall, broken by circular arches and windows, called now the clerestory. In the low walls of the side aisles were also windows. Both the nave and the aisles supported a framework of roof, lined with a ceiling adorned with painting. For some time we see no marked departure at this stage from the ancient basilica. The church is simple, not much adorned, and adapted to preaching. The age in which it was built was the age of pulpit orators, when bishops preached, like Basil, Chrysostom, Ambrose, Augustine, and Leo, when preaching was an important part of the service, by the foolishness of which the world was to be converted. Probably there were but few what we should call fine churches, but there was one at Rome which was justly celebrated, built by Theodosius and called St. Paul's. It is now outside the walls of the modern city. The nave is divided into 5 aisles, and the main one, opening into the apsis, is spanned by a lofty arch supported by 2 colossal columns. The apsis is 80 feet in breadth. All parts of the church, one of the largest of Rome, are decorated with mosaics. It has 2 small transepts at the extremity of the nave on each side of the apsis. The 4 rows of magnificent columns, supporting semicircular arches, are Corinthian. In this church the Greek and Roman architecture predominates. The essential form of the church is like a pagan basilica. We see convenience, but neither splendor nor poetry. Moreover, it is cheerful. It has an altar and an apsis, but it is adapted to preaching rather than to singing. The public dangers produce oratory, not chants. The voice of the preacher penetrates the minds of the people, as did that of Savonarola at Florence, announcing the invasion of Italy by the French. Days of fear and anxiety, reminding us also of Chrysostom at Antioch, when in his spacious basilican church he roused the people to penitence, to avert the ire of Theodosius. The first transition from the basilica to the Gothic church is called the Romanesque, and was made after the fall of the empire, when the barbarians had erected new kingdoms on its ruins, when literature and art were indeed crushed, yet when universal desolation was succeeded by new forms of government and new habits of life, when the clergy had become an enormous power, greatly enriched by the contributions of Christian princes. This transition retained the traditions of the fallen empire, and yet was adapted to a semi-civilized people, nominally converted to Christianity. It arose after the fall of the Merovingians, when Charlemagne was seeking to restore the glory of the Western Empire. Paganism had been suppressed by law, even heresies were extinguished in the West. Kings and people were alike orthodox, and bowed to the domination of the Church. Abbeys and convents were founded everywhere, and richly endowed. The different states and kingdoms were poor, but the wealth that existed was deposited in sacred retreats. The powers of the state were the nobles, warlike and ignorant, rapidly becoming feudal barons, acknowledging only a nominal fealty to the crown. Kings had no glory, defied by their own subjects and unsupported by standing armies. But these haughty barons were met face to face by equally haughty bishops, armed with spiritual weapons. These bishops were surrounded and supported by priests, secular and regular, by those who ruled the people in small parishes, and those who ruled the upper classes in their monastic cells. Learning had fled to monasteries, what little there was, and the church became a new attraction. The architects of the Romanesque, who were probably churchmen, retained the nave of the basilica, but made it narrower, and used but 2 rows of columns. They introduced the transepts, or cross enclosures, making them to project north and south of the nave, in the space separated from the apsis, and the apsis was expanded into the choir, filled with priests and choristers. The building now assumes the form of a cross. The choir is elevated several steps above the nave, and beneath it is the crypt, where the bishops and abbots and saints are buried. At the intersection of choir, nave, and transept, an open, square place, rises a square tower, on each corner of which is a massive pier supporting 4 arches. The windows are narrow, with semicircular arches. At the western entrance, at the end opposite the apse, is a small porch, where the consecrated water is placed in an urn or basin, and this is enclosed between 2 towers. The old Roman atrium, or forecourt, entirely disappears. In its place is a grander façade, and the pillars, which are all internal, like those of an Egyptian temple, not external, as in the Greek temple, have no longer Grecian capitals, but new combinations of every variety, and the pillars are even more heavy and massive than the Doric. The flat wooden ceiling of the nave disappears on account of frequent fires, and the eye rests on arches supporting a stone roof. All the arches are semicircular, like those of the Colosseum and of the Roman aqueducts and baths. They are built of small stones united with cement. The building is low and heavy, and its external beauty is in the west front or façade, with its square towers and circular window and ornamented portal. The internal beauty from the pillars supporting the roof and the tower which intersects the nave, choir, and transepts. Sometimes instead of a tower there is a dome, reminding us of Byzantine workmanship. But this Romanesque church is also connected with monastic institutions, whose extensive buildings join the church at the north or south. The church is wedded to monasticism, one supports the other, and both make a unity exceedingly efficient in the Middle Ages. The communication between the church and the convent is effected by a cloister, a vaulted gallery surrounding a square open space, where the brothers walk and meditate, but do not talk except in undertone or whisper, for all the precincts are sacred, made for contemplation and silence, a retreat from the noisy, barbaric world. Connected with the cloisters is a court opening into the refectory, where the brothers dine on herbs and eggs and a little meat, also in silence, and, where the rule is strict, in gloom, an ascetic, dreary discipline. The whole range of buildings is enclosed with walls like a fortress. You see in this architecture the gloom and desolation which overspread the world. Churches are heavy and sombre; they are places for dreary meditation on the end of the world, on the failure of civilization, on the degradation of humanity, and yet the only places where man may be brought in contact with the Deity who presides over a fallen world, exalting human hopes to heaven, where miseries end and worship begins. This style of architecture prevailed till the 12th century, and was seen in its greatest perfection in Germany under the Saxon emperors, especially in the Rhenish provinces, as in the cathedrals of Spires, Mentz, Worms, and Nuremberg. Its general effect was gloomy and heavy, a separation from the outward world, a world disgraced by feudal wars and peasants' wrongs and general ignorance, which made men sad, morose, inhuman. It flourished in ages when the poor had no redress, and were trodden under the feet of hard feudal masters, when there was no law but of brute force, when luxuries were few and comforts rare, an age of hardship, privation, poverty, suffering, an age of isolations and sorrows, when men were forced to look beyond the grave for peace and hope, when immortality through a Redeemer was the highest inspiration of life. Everybody was agitated by fears. The clergy made use of this universal feeling by presenting the terrors of the law, the penalty of sin, everlasting physical burnings, from which the tortured soul could be extricated only by penance and self-expiation, offerings to the Church, and entire subserviency to the will of the priest, who held the keys of heaven and hell. The men who lived when the Romanesque churches dotted every part in Europe looked upon society and saw nothing but grief, heavy burdens, injustices, oppressions, cruel wrongs, and they hid their faces and wept and said, "Let us retreat from this miserable world which discord ravages. Let us hide ourselves in contemplation. Let us prepare to meet God in judgment. Let us bring him our offering. Let us propitiate him. Let us build him a house where we may chant our mournful songs." So the Church arises in Germany, in France, in England, a solemn, mystical, massive, a type of sorrow in the form of a cross, with a sepulchral crypt like the man in the tomb, before the lofty spire pointed to the man who had risen to heaven. The Church is still struggling, and is not jubilant, except in Gregorian chants, and is therefore not lofty or ornamental. It is a vault. It is more like a catacomb than a basilica, for the world is buried deep in sorrows and fears. Look to any of the Saxon churches of the period when the Romanesque prevailed, and they are low, gloomy, and damp, though massive and solemn. The Church as an edifice ever represents the Church as an institution or a power, ever typifies prevailing sentiments and ideas. Perhaps the finest of the old Romanesque churches was that of Cluny, in Burgundy, destroyed during the French Revolution. It had 5 aisles and was 520 feet in length. It had a stately tower at the intersection of the transepts, and 6 other towers. It was early Norman, and loftier than the Saxon churches, although heavy and massive like them. But the Romanesque church, with all its varieties, is still gloomy, dark, sepulchral, reminding us of the sorrows of the Middle Ages, and the dreary character of prevailing religious sentiments. Fervent, sincere, profound, but sad. The sentiments of an age of ignorance and faith. The Crusades came. A new era burst upon the world. The old ideas became modified. Society became more cheerful, became more chivalric, adventurous, poetic. The world opened towards the East, and was larger than was before supposed. Liberality of mind began to dawn on the darkened ages; no longer were priests supreme. The gay provincials began to sing; the universities began to teach and to question; the scholastic philosophy sent forth such daring thinkers as Erigena and Abélard. Orthodoxy was still supreme before such mighty intellects as Anselm, Bernard, and Thomas Aquinas, but it was assailed. Abélard put forth his puzzling questions. The schoolmen began to think for themselves, and the iron weight of feudalism was less oppressive. Free cities and commerce began to enrich the people. Kings were becoming more powerful; grim spiritual despotism was less arrogant. The end of the world, it was found, had not come. A glorious future began to shed forth the beams of its coming day. It was the dawn of a new civilization. So a lighter, more cheerful, and grander architecture, with symbolic beauties, appeared with changing ideas and sentiments. The Church, no longer a gloomy power, struggling with Saracens and barbarism, but dominant, triumphant, issues forth from darksome crypts and soars upward, elevates her vaulted roofs. The Oriental ogive appears. The architects heap arcade on arcade, ogive on ogive, pyramid on pyramid, and give to all geometrical symmetry and artistic grace. The Greek column is there, but dilated to colossal proportions, and exfoliated in a variegated capital. The old Roman arch disappears, and the pointed arch is substituted, graceful and elevated. The old Egyptian obelisk appears in the spire reaching to heaven, full of aspiration. The window becomes larger and encroaches on the naked wall, and radiates in mystic roses. The arches widen, and the piers become more lofty. Stained glass appears, and diffuses religious light. Every part of the church becomes decorated and symbolical and harmonious, though infinitely variegated. The altars have pictures over them. Shrines and monuments appear in the niches. The dresses of the priests are more gorgeous. The music of the choir peals forth hallelujahs. Christ is risen from the tomb. The purple of his blood colors the windows. The roof, like pinnacles and spires, seems to reach the skies. The pressure of the walls is downward rather than lateral. The vertical lines of Cologne are as marked as the old horizontal lines of the Parthenon. The walls are not so heavy, and are supported by buttresses, which give increased beauty to the exterior, greater light and shade. Every part of the church seems to press forward and strive for greater freedom, for outward manifestation. Even the broad and expansive window presses to the outer surface of the walls, now broken by buttresses and pinnacles. The window, the eye of the edifice, is more cheerful and intelligent. More calm is the imposing façade, with its mighty towers and lofty spires, tapering like a pyramid, with its round oriel window, rich in beautiful tracery, and its wide portal with sculptured saints and martyrs. And in all the churches you see geometrical proportions. Even the cross of the church is deduced from the figure by which Euclid constructed the equilateral triangle. The columns present the proportions of the Doric, as to diameter and height. The love of the true and beautiful meet. The natural and supernatural both appear. All parts symbolize the passion of Christ. If the crypt speaks of death, the lofty and vaulted roof and the beautiful pointed arches and the cheerful window and the jubilant chants speak of life. The old church reminds one of the Christ that lay in the tomb, the new of the Christ who arose on the third day. The old fosters meditation and silence; the new kindles the imagination by its variety of perspective arrangement and mystic representation, still reverential, still expressive of consecrated sentiments, yet more cheerful. The foliated shaft, the rich tracery of the window, the graceful pinnacle, the Arabian gorgeousness of the interior, as if the Crusaders had learned something from the East. The innumerable shrines and pictures, the variegated marbles of the altar, with its vessels of silver and gold, the splendid dresses of the priests, the imposing character of the ritualism, the treasures lavished everywhere, all speak greater independence, wealth, and power. The church takes the place of all amusements; its various attractions draw together the people from their farms and shops. They gaily dress, as if they were attending a festival. Their condition is so improved that they have time for holidays. And these the church multiplies, for perpetual toil is the grave of intellect. The people must have rest, amusement, excitement. All these things the Catholic Church gives and consecrates. Crusader, baron, knight, priest, peasant, all resort to the church for benedictions. Women too are there, and in greater numbers, and they linger for the confessional. When the time comes that women stay away from the church, like busy, preoccupied, skeptical men, then let us be on the watch for some great catastrophe, since practical paganism will then be restored, and the angels of light will have left the earth. End of section 20. Section 21 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. William of Wykeham, Part 2. Paris and its neighborhood was the cradle of this new development of architecture which we wrongly call the Gothic, even as Paris was the center of the newborn intelligence of the era. The word Gothic suggests destructive barbarism. The English, the French, and Germans descended chiefly from Normans, Saxons, and Burgundians. This form of church architecture rapidly spreads to Germany, England, and Spain. The famous Suger, the minister of a powerful king, built the abbey of Saint Denis. The churches of Rheims, Paris, and Bourges arose in all their grandeur. The façade of Rheims is the most significant example of the wonderful architecture of the 13th century. In the church of Amiens you see the perfection of the so-called Gothic. So graceful are its details, so dazzling is its height. The central aisle is 132 feet in altitude, only surpassed by that of Beauvau, which is 14 feet higher. It was then that the Cathedral of Rouen was built, with its elegant lightness, a marvel to modern travellers. Soon after, the Cathedral of Cologne appears, more grand than either, but left unfinished, with its central aisle 44 feet in width, rising 140 feet into the air, with its colossal towers, intended to support the slender open-work spires, 520 feet in height. The whole church is 532 feet in length. I confess this church made a greater impression on my mind than did any Gothic church in Europe, more even than Milan, with its unnumbered pinnacles and statues and its marble roof. I could not rest while surveying its 10,000 wonders, so much lightness combined with strength, so grand and yet so cheerful, so exquisitely proportioned, so complicated in details, and yet a grand unity, a glorious and fit temple for the reverential worship of the Deity. Oh, how grand are those monuments which were designed to last through ages, and which are consecrated, not to traffic, not to pleasure, not to material wealth, but to the worship of that Almighty God to whom every human being is personally responsible. I cannot enumerate the churches of medieval Europe, built possibly by the Freemasons, certainly by men familiar with all that is practical in their art, with all that is hallowed and poetical. I glance at the English cathedrals built during this epoch, the period of the Crusades and the revival of learning. And here I allude to the man who furnishes me with a text to my discourse, William of Wykeham, Chancellor and Prime Minister of Edward III, the contemporary of Chaucer and Wyclif, who flourished in the 14th century, and who built Winchester Cathedral, a great and benevolent prelate, who also founded other colleges and schools. But I merely allude to him, since my subject is the art to which he gave an impulse, rather than any single individual. No one man represents church architecture any more appropriately than any one man represents the feudal system, or monasticism, or the Crusades, or the French Revolution. I do not think the English cathedrals are equal to those of Cologne, Rheims, Amiens, and Rouen, but they are full of interest, and they have varied excellences. That of Salisbury is the only one which is of uniform style. Its glory is in its spire, as that of Lincoln is in its west front, and that of Westminster is in its nave. Gloucester is celebrated for its choir, and York for its tower. In all are beautiful vistas of pillars and arches, but they lack the inspiration of the Catholic Church. They are indeed hoary monuments, petrified mysteries, a passion of stone, as Michelet speaks of the marble histories which will survive his rhapsodies. They alike show the pilgrimage of humanity through gloomy centuries. If their great wooden screens were removed, which separate the choir from the nave, the cathedrals doubtless would appear to more advantage, and especially if they were filled with altars and shrines and pictures, and lighted candles on the altars, filled also with crowds of worshippers, reverent before the gorgeously attired ministers of divine omnipotence, and excited by transporting chants and the various appeals to sense and imagination. The reason must be assisted by the imagination before the mind can revel in the glories of Gothic architecture. Imagination intensifies all our pleasures, even those of sense, and without imagination, yea, a memory stored with the pious deeds of saints and martyrs in bygone ages, a Gothic cathedral is as much a sealed book as Wordsworth is to Taine. The Protestant tourist from Michigan or Pennsylvania can "do" any cathedral in 2 hours, and wonder why they make such a fuss about a church not half so large as the New York Central Railroad station. The wonders of cathedrals must be studied, like the glories of a landscape, with an eye to the beautiful and the grand, cultured and practised by the contemplation of ideal excellence, when the mind summons the imagination to its aid, with all the poetry and all the history which have been learned in a life of leisure and study. How different the emotions of a Ruskin or a Tennyson, in surveying those costly piles, from those of a man fresh from a distillery or from a warehouse of cotton fabrics, or even from those of many fashionable women whose only aesthetic accomplishment is to play languidly and mechanically on an instrument, and whose only intellectual achievement is to have devoured a dozen silly novels in the course of a summer spent in alternate sleep and dalliance. Nor does familiarity always give a zest to the pleasure which arises from the creations of art or the glories of nature. The Roman beggar passes the Colosseum or St. Peter's without notice or enjoyment, as a peasant sees unmoved the snow-capped mountains of Switzerland or the beautiful lakes of Killarney. Said sorrowfully my guide up the Rigi, "I wish I lived in Holland, for there are men there." Yet there are those whom the ascent of Rigi and the ruined monuments of ancient Rome would haunt for a lifetime, in whose memory they would be perpetually fresh, never to pass away, any more than the looks and the vows of early love from the mind of a sentimental woman. The glorious old architecture whose peculiarity was the pointed arch, flourished only about 300 years in its purity and matchless beauty. Then another change took place. The ideal became lost in meaningless ornaments. The human figure peoples the naked walls. Man places his own image everywhere. The tomb rises like a mausoleum in side chapels. Man is enthroned, not God. The corruption of the art keeps pace with the corruption of the papacy and the discords of society. In the 14th century the mediaeval has lost its charm and faith. And then sets in the new era, which begins with Michelangelo. It is marked by the revival of Greek art and Greek literature. At Florence reign the Medici. On the throne of St. Peter sits an Alexander VI or a Julius II. Genoa is a city of merchant palaces. Museums are collected of the excavated remains of Roman antiquity. Everybody kindles with the contemplation of the long buried glories of a classic age. Everybody reads the classic authors. Cicero is a greater oracle than St. Augustine. Scholars flock to Italy. The popes encourage the growing taste for pagan philosophy. Ancient art regains her long abdicated throne and wields her sceptre over the worshippers of the Parthenon and the admirers of Aeschylus and Thucydides. With the revived statues of Greece appear the most beautiful pictures ever produced by the hand of man, and with pictures and statues architecture receives a new development. It is the blending of the old Greek and Roman with the Gothic, and is called the Renaissance. Michelangelo erects St. Peter's, the heathen Parthenon, on the intersection of Gothic nave and choir and transept, a glorious dome, more beautiful than any Gothic spire or tower, rising 450 feet into the air. And in the interior are classic circular arches and pillars, so vast that one is impressed as with great feats of engineering skill. All that is variegated in marbles adorns the altars. All that is bewitching in paintings is transferred to mosaics. And this new style of Italy spreads into France and England. Sir Christopher Wren builds St. Paul's, more Grecian than Gothic, and fills London with new churches, not one of which is Gothic, and all different. The brain is bewildered in attempting to classify the new and ever-shifting forms of the revived Italian. And so for 300 years the architects mingle the Gothic with the classical, until now a mongrel architecture is the disgrace of Europe. Varied but not expressive, resting on no settled principles, neither on vertical nor on horizontal lines, blended together, sometimes Grecian porticos on Elizabethan structures, spires resting not on towers but roofs, Byzantine domes on Grecian temples, Greek columns with Lombard arches, flamboyant paneling, pendant pillars from the roof, all styles mixed up together, Corinthian pilasters acting as Gothic buttresses, and pointed arches with Doric friezes, a heap of diverse forms, alien alike from the principles of Wykeham and Vitruvius. And this varied mongrel style of architecture corresponds with the confused civilization of the period, neither Greek nor Gothic, but a mixture of both, intolerant priests wrangling with pagan skeptics and infidels, Aquaviva with Pascal, the hierarchy of the French Church with Voltaire and Rousseau, Protestant divines with the Catholic clergy, Geneva and Rome compromising at Oxford, the authority of the Fathers made antagonistic to the authority of popes, new vernacular tongues supplanting Latin in the universities. Everywhere war on the Middle Ages, without full emancipation from their dogmas, ancient paganism made to uphold the Church, an unbounded activity of intellect casting off all established rules, the revival of the old Greek republics, democracy asserting its claim against absolute power, nothing settled, nothing at rest, but motion in every direction, science combating faith, faith spurning reason, humanity arrogating divinity, the confusion of races, Babel towers of vanity and pride in the new projected enterprises, Christian nations embroiled in constant wars, gold and silver set up as idols, the rise of new powers in the shapes of new industries and new inventions, commerce filling the world with wealth, armies contending for rights as well as for the aggrandizement of monarchies. Was there ever such a simmering and boiling and fermenting period of activity since the world began? In such a wild and tumultuous agitation of passions and interests and ideas, how could art reappear either in the classic severity of Greek temples or the hoary grandeurs of mediaeval cathedrals? In this jumble we look for new creations, but no creations in art appear, only fantastic imitations. There is no creation except in a new field, that of science and mechanical inventions, where there is the most extraordinary and astonishing development of human genius ever seen on earth, but of the earth earthy, aiming at material good. Architecture itself is turned into great feats of engineering. It does not span the apsis of a church, it spans rivers and valleys. The church indeed passes out of mind, if not out of sight, in the new material age, in the multiplication of bridges and gigantic reservoirs, old Rome brought back again in its luxuries. And yet the exactness of science and the severity of criticism, begun 50 years ago, in the verification of principles, produce a better taste. Architects have sought to revive the purest forms of both Gothic and Grecian. If they could not create a new style, they would imitate the old; as in philosophy, they would go round in the old circles. As science revives the atoms of Democritus, so art would reproduce the ideas of Phidias and Vitruvius, and even the poetry and sanctity of the Middle Ages. Within 50 years Christendom has been covered with Gothic churches, some of which are as beautiful as those built by Freemasons. The cathedrals have been copied rigidly, even for village churches. The Parthenon reappears in the Madeleine. We no longer see, as in the 18th century, Gothic spires on Roman basilicas or Grecian porticos ornamenting Norman towers. The various styles of 2000 years are not mixed up in the same building. We copy either the horizontal lines of paganism or the vertical lines of the ages of faith. No more harmonious Gothic edifice was ever erected than the new Catholic Cathedral of New York. Though only absurdity is seen when radical Protestantism adopts the Church of pomps and liturgies. When the Reformation was completed, men sought to build churches where they could hear the voice of the preacher, for the mission of Protestantism is to teach, not to sing. Protestantism glories in its sermons as much as Catholicism in its chants. If the people wish to return again to ritualism, let them have the Gothic Church. If they wish to be electrified by eloquence, let them have a basilica, for the voice of the preacher is lost in high and vaulted roofs. If they wish to join in the prayers and the ceremonies of the altar, let them have the clustering pillars and the purple windows. Everything turns upon what is meant by a church. What is it for? Is it for liturgical services, or is it for pulpit eloquence? Solve that question, and you solve the Reformation. My house, saith the divine voice, shall be called the house of prayer. It is by the foolishness of preaching, said Paul, that men are saved. If you will have the prayers of the Middle Ages and the sermons of the Reformation both together, then let the architects invent a new style which shall allow the blending of prayer and pulpit eloquence. You cannot have them both in a Grecian temple or in a Gothic church. You must combine the Parthenon with Salisbury, which is virtually a new miracle of architecture. Will that miracle be wrought? I do not know. But a modern Protestant church, with all the wonders of our modern civilization, must be something new, some new combination which shall be worthy of the necessity of our times. This is what the architect must now aspire to accomplish. He must produce a house in which one can both hear the sermon and be stimulated by inspiring melodies, for the church must have both. The Psalms of David and the chants of Gregory must be blended with the fervid words of a Chrysostom and a Chalmers. This, at least, should be borne in mind. The church edifice must be adapted to the end designed. The Gothic architects adapted their vaults and pillars to the ceremonies of the Catholic ritual. If it is this you want, then copy Gothic cathedrals. But if it is preaching you want, then restore the Grecian temple, or better still, the Roman theatre, where the voice of the preacher is not lost either in Byzantine domes or Gothic vaults, whose height is greater than their width. The preacher must draw by the distinctness of his tones, for every preacher has not the musical voice of Chrysostom, or the electricity of St. Bernard. He can neither draw nor inspire if he cannot be heard. He speaks to stones, not to living men or women. He loses his power, and is driven to chants and music to keep his audience from deserting him. He must make his choir an orchestra, he must hide himself in priestly vestments, he must import opera singers to amuse and not instruct. He cannot instruct when he cannot be heard, and heard easily. Unless the people catch every tone of his voice, his electricity will be wasted, and he will preach in vain, and be tired out by attempting to prevent echoes. The voice of St. Paul would be lost in some of our modern fashionable churches. Think of the absurdity of Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians affecting to restore Gothic monuments, when the great end of sacred eloquence is lost in those devices which appeal to sense. Think of the folly of erecting a church for 800 people as high as Westminster Abbey. It is not the size of a church which prevents the speaker from being heard. It is the disproportion of height with breadth and length, and the echoes produced by arcades. Spurgeon is heard easily by 7,000 people, and Talmage by 6,000, and Dr. Hall by 4,000, because the buildings in which they preach are adapted to public speaking. Those that erect theatres take care that a great crowd shall be able to catch even the whispers of actors. What would you think of the good sense and judgment of an architect who should construct a reservoir that would leak, in order to make it ornamental, or a schoolhouse without ventilation, or a theatre where actors could only be seen, or a hotel without light and convenient rooms, or a railroad bridge which would not support a heavy weight? A Protestant church is designed, no matter what the sect may be to which it belongs, not for poetical or aesthetic purposes, not for the admiration of architectural expenditures, not even for music, but for earnest people to hear from the preacher the words of life and death, that they may be aroused by his enthusiasm or instructed by his wisdom. Where the poor are not driven to a few back seats in the gallery, where the meeting is cheerful and refreshing, where all are stimulated to duties. It must not be dark, damp, and gloomy, where it is necessary to light the gas on a foggy day, and where one must be within 10 feet of the preacher to see the play of his features. Take away facilities for hearing and even for seeing the preacher, and the vitality of a Protestant service is destroyed, and the end for which people assemble is utterly defeated. Moreover, you destroy the sacred purposes of a church if you make it so expensive that the poor cannot get sittings. Nothing is so dull, depressing, funereal as a church occupied only by prosperous pew holders, who come together to show their faces and prove their respectability, rather than to join in the paeans of redemption or to learn humiliating lessons of worldly power before the altar of omnipotence. To the poor the gospel is preached, and it is ever the common people who hear most gladly gospel truth. Ah, who are the common people? I fancy we are all common people when we are sick, or in bereavement, or in adversity, or when we come to die. But if advancing society, based on material wealth and Epicurean pleasure, demands churches for the rich and churches for the poor, if the lines of society must be drawn somewhere, let those architects be employed who understand, at least, the first principles of their art. I do not mean those who learn to draw pictures in the back room of a studio, but conscientious men, if you cannot find sensible men. And let the pulpit itself be situated where the people can hear the speaker easily, without straining their eyes and ears. Then only will the speaker's voice ring and kindle and inspire those who come together to hear God's almighty message. Then only will he be truly eloquent and successful, since then only does his own electricity permeate the whole mass. Then only can he be effective and escape the humiliation of being only a part of a vain show, where his words are disregarded and his strength is wasted in the echoes of vaults and recesses copied from the gloomy though beautiful monuments of ages which can never, never again return, any more than can the granite image worship of the Egyptians, the oracles of Dodona, or the bulls of the medieval popes. Authorities: Ferguson's History of Architecture, Durand's Parallels, Eastlake's Gothic and Revival, Ruskin, Daly and Penrose, Britton's Cathedrals and Architectural Antiquities, Pusian's Specimens and Examples of Gothic Architecture, Rickman's Style of Gothic Architecture, Street's Gothic Architecture in Spain, Encyclopaedia Britannica, article Architecture. End of section 21. Section 22 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. John Wyclif, Part 1. A.D. 1324 to 1384, dawn of the Reformation. The name of Wyclif suggests the dawn of the Protestant Reformation, and the Reformation suggests the existence of evils which made it a necessity. I do not look upon the Reformation, in its earlier stages, as a theological movement. In fact, the Catholic and Protestant theology, as expounded and systematized by great authorities, does not materially differ from that of the Fathers of the Church. The doctrines of Augustine were equally accepted by Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. What is called systematic divinity, as taught in our theological seminaries, is a series of deductions from the writings of Paul and other apostles, elaborately and logically drawn by Athanasius, Jerome, Augustine, and other lights of the early Church, which were defended in the Middle Ages with amazing skill and dialectical acuteness by the scholastic doctors, with the aid of the method which Aristotle, the greatest logician of antiquity, bequeathed to philosophy. Neither Luther nor Calvin departed essentially from these great deductions on such vital subjects as the existence and attributes of God, the Trinity, sin and its penalty, redemption, grace, and predestination. The creeds of modern Protestant churches are in harmony with the writings of both the Fathers and the scholastic doctors on the fundamental principles of Christianity. There are indeed some ideas in reference to worship, and the sacraments in the government of the Church, and aids to a religious life, defended by the scholastic doctors, which Protestants do not accept, and for which there is not much authority in the writings of the Fathers. But the main difference between Protestants and Catholics is in reference to the institutions of the Church. Institutions which gradually arose with the triumph of Christianity in its contest with paganism, and which received their full development in the Middle Ages. It was the enormous and scandalous corruptions which crept into these institutions which led to the cry for reform. It was the voice of Wyclif denouncing these abuses which made him famous and placed him in the van of reformers. These abuses were generally admitted and occasionally attacked by churchmen and laymen alike, even by the poets. They were too flagrant to be denied. Now, what were the prominent evils in the institutions of the Church which called for reform, and in reference to which Wyclif raised up his voice? For in his day there was only one Church, and enumeration of these is necessary before we can appreciate the labors and teachings of the Reformer. I can only state them, I cannot enlarge upon them. I state only what is indisputable, not in reference to theological dogmas so much as to morals and ecclesiastical abuses. The center and life and support of all was the papacy. An institution, a great government, not a religion. I have spoken of this great power as built up by Leo I, Gregory VII, and Innocent III, and by others whom I have not mentioned. So much may be said of the necessity of a centralized spiritual power in the dark ages of European society, that I shall not combat this power or stigmatize it with offensive epithets. The necessity of the times probably called it into existence, like other governments, although I cannot see any argument drawn from the Scriptures or from the history of the early Apostolic Church to warrant its existence. Nor would I defend the long series of papal usurpations by which the Roman pontiffs got possession of the government of both Church and State. I speak not of their quarrels with princes about investitures, in which their genius and heroism were displayed rather than by efforts in behalf of civilization. But the popes exercised certain powers and prerogatives in England about the time of Wyclif, which were exceedingly offensive to the secular rulers of the land. They claimed the island as a sort of property which reason and the laws did not justify, a claim which led to heavy exactions and forced contributions on the English people that crippled the government and impoverished the nation. Boys and favorites were appointed by the popes to important posts and livings. Church preferments were almost exclusively in the hands of the pope, and these were often bought. A yearly tribute had been forced on the nation in the time of John. Peter's pence were collected from the people. Enormous sums, under various pretenses, flowed to Rome, and the clergy were taxed as well as the laity. The contributions which were derived from the sale of benefices, from investitures, from the transfer of sees, from the bestowal of rings and croziers (badges of episcopal authority), from the confirmation of elections and other taxes, irritated sovereigns and called out the severest denunciation of statesmen. Closely connected with papal exactions was the enormous increase of the mendicant friars, especially the Dominicans and Franciscans, who had been instituted by Innocent III to uphold the papal domination. These itinerating beggars in their black and gray gowns infested every town and village in England. For a century after their institution they were the ablest and perhaps the best soldiers of the Pope, and did what the Jesuits afterwards performed, and perhaps the Methodists 100 years ago, gained the hearts of the people and stimulated religious life. But in the 14th century they were a nuisance. They sold indulgences, they invented pious frauds, they were covetous under pretense of poverty, they had become luxurious in their lives, they slandered the regular clergy, they usurped the prerogatives of parish priests, they enriched their convents, they accommodated themselves to the wishes of the great, and were marked by those peculiarities of which the Jesuits were accused in the time of Pascal. As they had not in England, as in Spain and Italy, tribunals of inquisition, they were ridiculed, despised, and hated rather than feared. One gets the truest impression of the popular estimate of these friars from the sarcasms of Chaucer. The Friar Tuck, whom Sir Walter Scott has painted, was a very different man from the Dominicans or the Franciscans of the 13th century, when they reigned in the universities, and were the confessors of monarchs and the most popular preachers of their time. In the 14th century they were consumed with jealousies and rivalries and animosities against each other; and all the various orders, Dominican, Franciscan, Carmelite, in spite of their professions of poverty, were the possessors of magnificent monasteries, and fattened on the credulity of the world. Besides these mendicant friars, England was dotted with convents and religious houses belonging to the different orders of Benedictines, which, though enormously rich, devoured the substance of the poor. There were more than 20,000 monks in a population of 3 or 4 millions, and most of them led idle and dissolute lives, and were subjects of perpetual reproach. Reforms of the various religious houses had been attempted, but all reforms had failed. Nor were the lives of the secular clergy much more respectable than those of the great body of monks. They are accused by all historians of avarice, venality, dissoluteness, and ignorance; and it was their incapacity, their disregard of duties, and indifference to the spiritual interests of their flocks, that led to the immense popularity of the mendicant friars, until they, in their turn, became perhaps a greater scandal than the parish priests, whose functions they had usurped. Both priests and monks in the time of Bishop Grosset of Lincoln frequented taverns and gambling houses. So enormous and scandalous was the wealth of the clergy, that as early as 1279, under Edward I, Parliament passed a statute of mortmain, forbidding religious bodies to receive bequests without the king's license. With the increase of scandalous vices among the clergy was a corruption in the doctrines of the Church, not those which are strictly theological, but those which pertain to the sacraments, and the conditions on which absolution was given and communion administered. In the 13th century, as the scholastic philosophy was reaching its fullest development, we notice the establishment of the doctrine of transubstantiation, the withholding the cup from the laity, and the necessity of confession as the condition of receiving the communion, which corruptions increased amazingly the power of the clergy over the minds of superstitious people, and led to still more flagrant evils, like the sale of indulgences and the perversion of the doctrine of penance, originally enforced in order to aid the soul to overcome the tyranny of the body, but finally accepted as the expiation for sin, so that the door of heaven itself was opened by venal priests only to those whom they could control or rob. Such was the state of the Church when Wyclif was born, in 1324, near Richmond in Yorkshire, about a century after the establishment of universities, the creation of the mendicant orders, and the memorable usurpation of Innocent III. In the year 1340, during the reign of Edward III, we find him at the age of 16 a student in Merton College at Oxford, the college then most distinguished for scholastic doctors, the college of Islip, of Bradwardine, of Ockham, and perhaps of Duns Scotus. It would seem that Wyclif devoted himself with great assiduity to the study which gave the greatest intellectual position and influence in the Middle Ages, and which required a training of 19 years in dialectics before the high degree of Doctor of Divinity was conferred by the university. We know nothing of his studious life at Oxford until he received his degree, with the title of Evangelical or Gospel Doctor, from which we infer that he was a student of the Bible, and was more remarkable for his knowledge of the Scriptures than for his dialectical skills. But even for his knowledge of the scholastic philosophy he was the most eminent man in the university, and he was as familiar with the writings of St. Augustine and Jerome as with those of Aristotle. It was not then the fashion to study the text of the Scriptures so much as the commentaries upon it, and he who was skilled in the Book of Sentences and the Summa Theologica stood a better chance of preferment than he who had mastered St. Paul. But Wyclif, it would seem, was distinguished for his attainments in everything which commanded the admiration of his age. In 1356, when he was 32, he wrote a tract on the last stages of the Church, in view of the wretchedness produced by the Great Plague 8 years before. In 1360, at the age of 36, he attacked the Mendicant orders, and his career as a reformer began. An unsuccessful reformer indeed, like John Huss, since the evils which he combated were not removed. He merely protested against the corruptions which good men lamented, and that is nearly all that great men can do when they are beyond their age. They are simply witnesses of the truth, and fortunate if they do not die as martyrs, for in the early Church witnesses and martyrs were synonymous. The year following, 1361, Wyclif was presented to the rich rectory of Fillingham by Balliol College, and was promoted the same year to the wardenship of that ancient college. The learned doctor is now one of the dons of the university; at that time, even more than now, a great dignitary. It would be difficult for an unlearned politician of the 19th century to conceive of the exalted position which a dignitary of the Church, crowned with scholastic honors, held 500 years ago. It gave him access to the table of his sovereign and to the halls of Parliament. It made him an oracle in all matters of the law. It created for him a hearing on all the great political as well as ecclesiastical issues of the day. What great authorities in the 13th century were Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventura! Scarcely less than they in the next century were Duns Scotus and John Wyclif, far greater in influence than any of the proud feudal lords who rendered service to Edward III, broad as were their acres and grand as were their castles. Strange as it may seem, the glory that radiated from the brow of a scholar or a saint was greatest in ages of superstition and darkness, perhaps because both scholars and saints were rare. The modern lights of learning may be better paid than in former days, but they do not stand out to the eye of admiring communities in such prominence as they did among our ancestors. Who stops and turns back to gaze reverentially on a poet or a scholar whom he passes by unconsciously, as both men and women strained their eyes to see an Abelard or a Dante? Even a Webster now would not command the homage he received 50 years ago. It is not uninteresting to contemplate the powers that have ruled in successive ages, outside the realms of conquerors and kings. In the 9th and 10th centuries they were baronial lords in mail-clad armor. In the 11th and 12th centuries these powers, like those of ancient Egypt, were priests. In the 13th and 14th centuries they were the learned doctors, as in the schools of Athens, when political supremacy was lost. In the 16th century, the era of reforms, they were controversial theologians, like those of the age of Theodosius. In the 17th century they were fighting nobles. In the 18th they were titled and hereditary courtiers and great landed proprietors. In the 19th they are bankers, merchants, and railway presidents, men who control the material interests of the country. It is only at elections, though managed by politicians, that the people are at power. Socially the magnates are the rich. It is money in which these times all classes combine to worship. If this be questioned, see the adulation which even colleges and schools of learning pay to their wealthy patrons or those from whom they seek benefits. The patrons of the schools in the Middle Ages were princes and nobles, but these princes and nobles bowed down in reverence to learned bishops and great theological doctors. Wyclif was the representative of the schools when he attacked the abuses of the Church. It is not a little singular that the great religious movements in England have generally come from Oxford, while Cambridge has been distinguished for great movements in science. In 1365 he was appointed to the headship of Canterbury Hall, founded by Archbishop Islip, afterwards merged into Christ Church, the most magnificent and wealthy of all the Oxford colleges. When Islip died in 1366, and Langham, originally a monk of Canterbury, was made archbishop, the appointment of Wyclif was pronounced void by Langham, and the revenues of the hall of which he was warden or president were sequestered. Wyclif on this appealed to the Pope, who, however, ratified Langham's decree, as it would be expected, for the Pope sustained the friars whom Wyclif had denounced. The spirit of such a progressive man was, of course, offensive to the head of the Church. In this case the crown confirmed the decision of the Pope, 1372, since the royal license was obtained by a costly bribe. The whole transaction was so iniquitous that Wyclif could not restrain his indignation. But before this decision of the crown was made, the services of Wyclif had been accepted by the Parliament in its resistance to the claim which Pope Urban V had made in 1366 to the arrears of tribute due under John's vassalage. Edward III had referred this claim to Parliament, and the Parliament had rejected it without hesitation on the ground that John had no power to bind the realm without its consent. The Parliament was the mere mouthpiece of Wyclif, who was now actively engaged in political life, and probably, as Dr. Leckler thinks, had a seat in Parliament. He was at any rate a very prominent political character, for he was sent in 1374 to Bruges as one of the commissioners to treat with the representatives of the French Pope in reference to the appointment of foreigners to the rich benefices of the Church of England, which gave great offence to the liberal and popular party in England. For there was such a progressive party as early as the 14th century, although it did not go by that name and was not organized as parties are now. In fact, in all ages and countries there are some men who are before their contemporaries. The great grievance of which the more advanced and enlightened complained was the interference of the Pope with ecclesiastical livings in England. Wyclif led the opposition to this usurpation, and this opposition to the Pope on the part of a churchman made it necessary for him to have a protector powerful enough to shield him from papal vengeance. This protector he found in John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who, next to the king, had the greatest authority in England. It is probable that Wyclif enjoyed at Bruges the friendship of this great man, great for his station, influence, and birth at least, who was at the head of the opposition to the papal claims, resisted not only by him but by Parliament, which seems to have been composed of men in advance of their age. As early as 1371 this Parliament had petitioned the king to exclude all ecclesiastics from the great offices of state, held almost exclusively by them as the most able and learned people of the realm. From the time of Alfred, this custom had not been seriously opposed by the baronial lords, who were ignorant and unenlightened. But in the 14th century light had broken in upon the darkness, the day had at least dawned, and the absurdity of confining the cares of state and temporal matters to men who ought to be absorbed with spiritual duties alone was seen by the more enlightened of the laity. But the king was not then prepared to part with the most efficient of his ministers because they happened to be ecclesiastics, and the custom continued for nearly 2 centuries longer. Bishop Williams was the last of the clergy who filled the great office of chancellor, and Archbishop Laud was the last of the clergy who became a prime minister. The reign of Elizabeth was marked, for the first time in the history of England, by the almost total exclusion of prelates from great secular offices. In the reign of Edward III it was William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, who held the Great Seal, and the Bishop of Exeter, who was the Lord Treasurer. Probably the 2 men in the whole realm who were the most experienced in public affairs as men of business. Wyclif, it would appear, although he was an ecclesiastic, here took the side of Parliament against his own order. In his treatise on the regimen of the Church, he contends that neither doctors nor deacons should hold secular offices, or even be land stewards or clerks of account, and appeals to the authority of the Fathers and St. Paul in the confirmation of his views. At this time he was a doctor of divinity and a professor of theology in the university, having been promoted to this high position in 1372, 2 years before he was sent as commissioner to Bruges. In 1375 he was presented to the rectory of Lutterworth in Leicestershire by the crown, in reward for his services as an ambassador. In 1376 Parliament renewed its assault on pontifical pretensions and exactions, and there was cause, since 20,000 marks or pounds were sent annually to Rome from the Pope's collector in England, which collector was a Frenchman, another indignity. Against these corruptions and usurpations Wyclif was unsparing in his denunciations, and the hierarchy at last were compelled, by their allegiance to Rome, to take measures to silence and punish him as a pertinacious heretic. The term heretic meant in those days opposition to papal authority, as much as opposition to the theological dogmas of the Church, and the brand of heresy was the greatest stigma which authority could impose. The bold denunciator of papal abuses was now in danger. He was summoned by the Convocation to appear in St. Paul's Cathedral and answer for his heresies, on which occasion were present the Archbishop of Canterbury and the arrogant Bishop of London, the latter the son of the Earl of Devonshire, of the great family of the Courtenays. Wyclif was attended by the Duke of Lancaster and the Earl Marshal, Henry Percy, the ancestor of the Dukes of Northumberland, who forced themselves into the Ladies' Chapel, behind the high altar, where the prelates were assembled. An uproar followed from this unusual intrusion of the two most powerful men of the kingdom into the very sanctuary of prelatic authority. What could be done when the great Oxford professor, the most learned scholastic of the kingdom, was protected by a royal duke clothed with viceregal power, and the Earl Marshal armed with the sword of the state? The position of Wyclif was as strong as it was before he was attacked, nor could he be silenced except by the authority of the Pope himself, still acknowledged as the supreme lord of Christendom. And the Pope now felt that he must assert his supremacy and interpose his supreme authority or lose his hold on England. So he hurled his weapons, not yet impotent, and fulminated his bulls, ordering the university, under penalty of excommunication, to deliver the daring heretic into the hands of the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Bishop of London, and further commanding these two prelates to warn the king against the errors of Wyclif, and to examine him as to his doctrines, and keep him in chains until the Pope's pleasure should be further known. In addition to these bulls, the Pope sent one to the king himself. It was resolved that the work should be done thoroughly this time. Yet it would appear that these various bulls threatening an interdict did not receive a welcome from any quarter. The prelates did not wish to quarrel with such an antagonist as the Duke of Lancaster, who was now the chief power in the state, the king being in his last illness. They allowed several months to pass before executing their commission, during which Wyclif was consulted by the great Council of State whether they should allow money to be carried out of the realm at the Pope's demands, and he boldly declared that they should not, thus coming in direct antagonism with hierarchical power. He also wrote at this time pamphlets vindicating himself from the charges made against him, asserting the invalidity of unjust excommunication, which, if allowed, would set the Pope above God. At last, after 7 months, the prelates took courage and ordered the university to execute the papal bulls. To imprison Wyclif at the command of the Pope would be to allow the Pope's temporal rule in England, yet to disobey the bulls would be disregard of the papal power altogether. In this dilemma the vice-chancellor, himself a monk, ordered a nominal imprisonment. The result of these preliminary movements was that Wyclif appeared at Lambeth before the archbishop to answer his accusers. The great prelates had a different spirit from the university, which was justly proud of its most learned doctor, a man too beyond his age and his progressive spirit, for the universities in those days were not so conservative as they subsequently became. At Lambeth, Wyclif found unexpected support from the people of London, who broke into the archiepiscopal chapel and interrupted the proceedings, and a still more efficient aid from the Queen Dowager, the Princess Joan, who sent a message forbidding any sentence against Wyclif. Thus he was backed by royal authority and the popular voice, as Luther was afterwards in Saxony. The prelates were overcome with terror and dropped the proceedings, while the vice-chancellor of Oxford, who had tardily and imperfectly obeyed the Pope, was cast into prison for a time and compelled to resign his office. End of section 22. Section 23 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. John Wyclif, Part 2. Wyclif had gained a great triumph, which he used by publishing a summary of his opinions in 33 articles, both in Latin and English. In these it would seem that he attacked the infallibility of the Pope, liable to sin like any other person, and hence to be corrected by the voices of those who are faithful to a higher power than his; a blow to the exercise of excommunication from any personal grounds of malice or hatred, or when used to extort unjust or mercenary demands. He also maintained that the endowments of the clergy could be lawfully withdrawn if they were perverted or abused, a bold assertion in his day, but which he professed he was willing to defend, even unto death. If the prelates had dared, or had possessed sufficient power, he would doubtless have suffered death from their animosity, but he was left unmolested in his retirement at his rectory, although he kept himself discreetly out of the way of danger. When the memorable schism took place in the Roman government by the election of an antipope, and both popes proclaimed a crusade and issued their indulgences, Wyclif, who heretofore had admitted the primacy of the Roman See, now openly proclaimed the doctrine that the Church would be better off with no pope at all. He owed his safety to the bitterness of the rival popes, who in their mutual quarrels had no time to think of him. And his opportunity was improved by writing books and homilies in which the anti-Christian claims of the popes were fearlessly exposed and commented upon. In fact, he now openly denounces the Pope as Antichrist, from his pulpit at Lutterworth to his simple-minded parishioners, for whose good he seems to have earnestly labored, the model of a parish priest. It is supposed that Chaucer had him in view when he wrote his celebrated description of a good parson, benign and diligent, learned and pious, giving a noble example to his flock of disinterestedness and devotion to truth and duty, in contrast with the ordinary lives of the clergy of those times, who were infamous for their ignorance, sensuality, gluttony, and ostentation, frequenting taverns and wasting their time in gambling, idleness, and disgraceful brawls. Hitherto, Wyclif had simply protested against the external evils of the Church without much effect, although protected by powerful laymen and encouraged by popular favor. The time had not come for a real and permanent reformation, but he prepared the way for it, and in no slight degree, by his translation of the Scriptures into the vernacular tongue, the greatest service he rendered to the English people and the cause of civilization. All the great reformers, successful and unsuccessful, appealed to the Scriptures as the highest authority, even when they did not rebel against the papal power, like Savonarola and Florence. I do not get the impression that Wyclif was a great popular preacher like the Florentine reformer, or like Luther, Latimer, and Knox. He was a student, first of the scholastic theology and afterwards of the Bible. He lived in a quiet way, as scholars love to live, in his retired rectory near Oxford, preaching plain and simple sermons to his parishioners, but spending his time chiefly in his library or study. Wyclif's translation of the Bible was a great event, for it was the first which was made in English, although parts of the Bible had been translated into the Saxon tongue between the 7th and 11th centuries. He had no predecessor in that vast work, and he labored amid innumerable obstacles. It was not a translation from the original Greek and Hebrew, for but little was known of either language in the 14th century. Not until the fall of Constantinople into the hands of the Turks was Greek or Hebrew studied, so the translation was made from the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome. The version of Wyclif, besides its transcendent value to the people, now able to read the Bible in their own language, before a sealed book except to the clergy and the learned, gave form and richness to the English language. To what extent Wyclif was indebted to the labors of other men it is not easy to determine, but there is little doubt that whatever aid he received, the whole work was under his supervision. Of course it was not printed, for printing was not then discovered, but the manuscripts of the version were very numerous, and they are today to be found in the great public libraries of England, and even in many private collections. Considering that the Latin Vulgate has ever been held in supreme veneration by the Catholic Church in all ages and countries, by popes, bishops, abbots, and schoolmen, that no jealousy existed as to the reading of it by the clergy generally, that in fact it was not a sealed book to the learned classes and was regarded universally as the highest authority in matters of faith and morals, it seems strange that so violent an opposition should have been made to its translation into vernacular tongues, and to its circulation among the people. Wyclif's translation was regarded as an act of sacrilege, worthy of condemnation and punishment. So furious was the outcry against him, as an audacious violator who dared to touch the sacred ark with unconsecrated hands, that even a bill was brought into the House of Lords forbidding the perusal of the Bible by the laity, and it would have been passed but for John of Gaunt. At a convocation of bishops and clerical dignitaries held in St. Paul's in 1408, it was decreed as heresy to read the Bible in English, to be punished by excommunication. The version of Wyclif and all other translations into English were utterly prohibited under the severest penalties. Fines, imprisonment, and martyrdom were inflicted on those who were guilty of so foul a crime as reading or possessing the Scriptures in the vernacular tongue. This is one of the gravest charges ever made against the Catholic Church. This absurd and cruel persecution alone made the Reformation a necessity, even as the translation of the Bible prepared the way for the Reformation. The translation of the Scriptures and the Reformation are indissolubly linked together. Nobody doubts that the whole influence of the Catholic hierarchy has ever been, and still continues to be, hostile to the perusal of the Scriptures by the people in the vulgar tongue, and it was this translation by Wyclif which made him more obnoxious to the Pope than all his tirades against the vices of the monks and the other evils which disgraced the Church. We cannot call this translation a reform, but it led to reforms. It arrayed the people against the usurpations of the Pope and the corruption of the Church as an institution. Yea, more, it was the main cause of that memorable religious movement which followed the death of Wyclif. There would have been no Lollards had there been no translation of the Bible. It led also to the affirmation of that private judgment which was the foundation pillar of Protestantism, and which existed among the Lollards long before Luther delivered his message. And yet it is not strange that the Catholic hierarchy, I say Catholic rather than Roman, because in the 14th century there was but one church, although in that church considerable difference of opinion existed both as to matters of faith and government, should have bitterly opposed the translation of the Scriptures into vernacular tongues, since it opened the door to private judgment. If there is anything the Catholic Church has hated, it is private judgment. The very phrase is obnoxious. It means the emancipation of the people from papal domination and ecclesiastical bondage of all description, while the thing itself is subversive of all the claims which the Catholic hierarchy have ever put forth as to the authority of the Church as an institution. It has undermined and will continue to undermine spiritual despotism, the great evil of the Middle Ages and of the Papal Church in our times. The unrestrained circulation of the Scriptures in the language the people can understand must lead to the breaking up of false doctrines and all the instruments by which the clergy have maintained their usurpations. It necessarily opens the eyes of the people to the anti-Christian doctrine of penance, to the absurdity of indulgences for sin, to the unwarranted worship of the Virgin Mary, to the monstrous claim of papal infallibility, and to all other glaring usurpations by which the popes have ruled the world. This is not a false doctrine in religion or an anti-Christian form of worship, nor a usurped prerogative of the Pope and clergy, which the unrestrained perusal of the Scriptures does not expose. Hinc illiae lacrimae. The dignitaries of the Roman Catholic Church are not fools. They know that the free circulation of the Scriptures in vulgar tongue does undermine their authority, and will ultimately destroy the edifice of pride and pomp and power which it took 1,000 years to build. This is what they ever have consistently opposed, and will continue to oppose, as a thing dangerous to them. They would have destroyed, if they could, every copy of the version which Wyclif made. And now they can no longer prevent the Bible from being printed. They would exclude it from the schools which they control, and from the houses of those who belong to their church. Doubtless the well-known opposition to the circulation of the Bible in the vernacular has been exaggerated, but in the 14th century it was certainly bitter and furious. Wyclif might expose vices which everybody saw and lamented as a scandal, and make himself obnoxious to those who committed them. But to open the door to free inquiry and a reformed faith and hostility to the Pope, this was a graver offence, to be visited with the severest penalties. To the storm of indignation thus raised against him, Wyclif's only answer was, "The clergy cry aloud that it is heresy to speak of the Holy Scriptures in English, and so they would condemn the Holy Ghost, who gave tongues to the apostles of Christ to speak the word of God in all languages under heaven." Notwithstanding the enormous cost of the Bible as translated by Wyclif, £2 16 shillings 8 pence, a sum probably equal to £30 or $150 of our present money, more than half the annual income of a substantial yeoman, still it was copied and circulated with remarkable rapidity. Neither the cost of the valuable manuscript nor the opposition and vigilance of an almost omnipresent Inquisition were able to suppress it. Wyclif was now about 58 years of age. He had rendered a transcendent service to the English nation, and a service that not one of his contemporaries could have performed, to which only the foremost scholar and theologian of his day was equal. After such a work he might have reposed in his quiet parish in genial rest, conscious that he had opened a new era in the history of his country. But rest was not for him. He now appears as a doctrinal controversialist. Hitherto his attacks had been against the flagrant external evils of the Church, the enormous corruptions that had entered into the institutions which sustained the papal power. He had been the advocate of the university in defense of her privileges, the champion of the crown in vindications of its rights and prerogatives, the friend of the people in the preservation of their property. He now assailed the Romish doctrine of the Eucharist, but without the support of those powerful princes and nobles who had hitherto sustained him. He combats one of the prevailing ideas of the age, a more difficult and infinitely bolder thing, which theologians had not dared to assail, and which in after times was a stumbling block to Luther himself. In ascending the mysterious mount where clouds gathered around him, his old friends began to desert him, for now he assailed the awful and invisible. The Church of the Middle Ages had asserted that the body of Christ was actually present in the consecrated wafer, and few there were who doubted it. Berengar had maintained in the 11th century that the sacred elements should be regarded as mere symbols, but he was vehemently opposed, with all the terrors of spiritual power, and compelled to abjure the heresy. In the year 1215, at a Lateran council, Innocent III established the doctrine of transubstantiation as one of the fundamental pillars of Catholic belief. Then metaphysics, all the weapons of scholasticism, were called into the service of superstition to establish what is most mythical in the creed of the Church, and which implied a perpetual miracle, since at the moment of consecration the substance of the bread was taken away, and the substance of Christ's body took its place. From his chair of theology at Oxford in 1381, Wyclif attacked what Lanfranc and Anselm and the doctors of the Church had uniformly and strenuously defended. His views of the Eucharist were substantially those which Archbishop Berengar had advanced 300 years before, and of course drew down upon him the censure of the Church. In his peril he appealed, not to the Pope or the clergy, but to the king himself, a measure of renewed audacity, for in those days no layman, however exalted, had authority in matters purely ecclesiastical. His boldness was too much even for the powerful Duke of Lancaster, his friend and patron, who forbade him to speak further on such a matter. He might attack the mendicant and itinerant friars who had forgotten their duties and their vows, but not the great mysteries of the Catholic faith. When he questioned the priestly power of absolution and the Pope's authority in purgatory, when he struck at indulgences and special masses, he had on his side the spiritual instincts of the people. But when he impugned the dignity of the central act of Christian worship and the highest expression of mystical devotion, it appeared to ordinary minds that he was denying all that is sacred, impressive, and authoritative in the sacrament itself. And he gave offence to many devout minds, who had approved his attacks on the monks and the various corruptions of the Church. Even the Parliament pressed the Archbishop to make an end of such a heresy, and Courtenay, who hated Wyclif, needed not to be urged. So a council was assembled at the Dominican convent at Blackfriars, where the Times office now stands, and unanimously condemned not only the opinions of Wyclif as to the Eucharist, but also those in reference to the power of excommunication and the uselessness of the religious orders. Yet he himself was allowed to escape, and the condemnation had no other effect than to drive him from Oxford to his rectory at Lutterworth, where until his death he occupied himself in literary and controversial writings. His illness soon afterwards prevented him from obeying the summons of the Pope to Rome, where he would doubtless have suffered as a martyr. In 1384 he was struck with paralysis, and died 3 days after the attack, at the age of 60, though some say in his 64th year, probably in spite of ecclesiastical censure, the most revered man of his day, as well as one of the ablest and most learned. Not from the ranks of fanatics or illiterate popular orators did the Reformation come in any country, but from the greatest scholars and theologians. This grand old man, the illustrious pioneer of reform in England, and indeed on the Continent, did not live to 80 years and 10, but being worn out with his exhaustive labors, he died peaceably and unmolested in his retired parish. Not much is known of the details of his personal history any more than of Shakespeare's. We know nothing of his loves and hatreds, of his habits and tastes, of his temper and person, of his friends and enemies. He stands out to the eye of posterity in solitary and mysterious loneliness. Tradition speaks of him as a successful, benignant, and charitable parish priest, giving consolation to the afflicted and to the sick. He lived in honor, professor of theology at Oxford, holding a prebendal stall in a parochial rectory, perhaps a seat in Parliament, and was employed by the Crown as an ambassador to Bruges. He was statesman as well as theologian, and lived among the great, more as a learned doctor than as a saint, which he was not from the Catholic standpoint. He was the scourge of imposture, the ponderous hammer which smote the brazen idolatry of his age. He labored to expose the vices that had taken shelter in the sanctuary of the Church, a reformer of ecclesiastical abuses rather than of the lax morals of the laity, and hence did different work from that of Savonarola, whose life was spent in a crusade against sin, wherever it was to be found. His labors were great, and his attainments remarkable for his age. He is accused of being coarse in his invectives, but that charge can also be laid to Luther and other reformers in rough and outspoken times. Considering the power of the Pope in the 14th century, Wyclif was as bold and courageous as Luther. The weakness of the papacy had not been exposed by the councils of Pisa, of Constance, and of Basel, Nor was popular indignation in view of the sale of indulgences as great in England as when the Dominican Tetzel peddled the papal pardons in Germany. In combating the received ideas of the age, Wyclif was even more remarkable than the Saxon reformer, who was never fully emancipated from the mediaeval doctrine of transubstantiation, although Luther went beyond Wyclif in the completeness of his reform. Wyclif was beyond his age. Luther was the impersonation of its passions. Wyclif represented universities and learned men. Luther was the oracle of the people. The former was the mediaeval doctor, the latter was the popular orator and preacher. The one was mild and moderate in his spirit and manners; the other was vehement, dogmatic, and often offensive, not only from his more violent and passionate nature, but for his bitter and ironical sallies. It is the manner more than the matter which offends. Had Wyclif been as satirical and boisterous as Luther was, he would not probably have ended his days in peace, and would not have accomplished so much as a preparation for reforms. It was the peculiarity of Wyclif to recognize occasional merits in the system he denounced, even when his language was most vehement. He admitted that confession did much good to some persons, although as a universal practice, as enjoined by Innocent III, it was an evil and harm to the Church. In regard to the worship of images, while he denounced the waste of treasure on dead stocks, he admitted that images might be used as aids to excite devotion. But if miraculous powers were attributed to them, it was an evil rather than a good. As to the adoration of the saints, he simply maintained that since gifts can be obtained only through the meditation of Christ, it would be better to pray to him directly rather than through the meditation of saints. In regard to the mendicant friars, it does not appear that his vehement opposition to them was based on their vows of poverty, or on the spirit which entered into monasticism in its best ages, but because they were untrue to their rule, because they were vendors of pardons, and absolved men of sins which they were ashamed to confess to their own pastors, and especially because they encouraged the belief that a benefaction to a convent would take the place of piety in the heart. It was the abuses of the system rather than the system itself which made him so wrathful on the vagrant friars preaching their catchpenny sermons. And so of other abuses of the Church. He did not defy the Pope or deny his authority until it was plain that he sought to usurp the prerogatives of kings and secular rulers, and to bring both the clergy and laity under his spiritual yoke. It was not as the first and chief of bishops, the head of the visible Church, that Wyclif attacked the Pope, but as a usurper and a tyrant, grasping powers which were not conferred by the early Church, and which did not culminate until Innocent III had instituted the mendicant orders, and enforced persecution for religious opinions by the terrors of the Inquisition. The wealth of the Church was a sore evil in his eyes, since it diverted the clergy from their spiritual duties, and was the cause of innumerable scandals, and was closely connected with simony and the accumulation of benefices in the hands of a single priest. So it was indignation in view of the corruptions of the Church and vehement attacks upon them that characterized Wyclif, rather than efforts to remove their causes, as was the case with Luther. He was not a radical reformer; he only prepared the way for radical reform by his translation of the Scriptures into a language the people could read, more than by any attacks on the monks or papal usurpations, or indulgences for sin. He was the type of a meditative scholar and theologian, thin and worn, without much charm of conversation, except to men of rank or great animal vivacity such as delights the people. Nor was he a religious genius like Thomas à Kempis, Anselm, and Pascal. He had no remarkable insight into spiritual things; his intellectual and moral nature preponderated over the emotional, so that he was charged with intellectual pride and desire for distinction. Yet no one disputed the blamelessness of his life and the elevation of his character. If Wyclif escaped the wrath and vengeance of Rome because of his high rank as a theological doctor, his connection with the University of Oxford, opposed to itinerating beggars with great pretensions and greedy ends, and his friendship and intercourse with the rulers of the land, his followers did not. They became very numerous, and were variously called Lollers, Wyclifites, and Biblemen. They kept alive evangelical religion until the time of Cranmer and Latimer, their distinguishing doctrine being that the Scriptures are the only rule of faith. There was no persecution of them of any account during the reign of Richard II, although he was a hateful tyrant, probably owing to the influence of his wife, a Bohemian princess who read Wyclif's Bible. But under Henry IV, evil days fell upon them, and persecution was intensified under Henry V. (1413 to 1422), because of their supposed rebellion. The Lollards under Archbishop Chichely, as early as 1416, were hunted down and burned as heretics. The severest inquisition was instituted to hunt up those who were even suspected of heresy, and every parish was the scene of cruelties. I need not here enumerate the victims of persecution continued with remorseless severity during the whole reign of Henry VII. But it was impossible to suppress the opinions of the reformers or to prevent the circulation of the Scriptures. The blood of martyrs was the seed of the Church. Persecution in this instance was not successful, since there was a noble material in England, as in Germany, for Christianity to work upon. It was in humble homes, among the yeomanry and artisans, that evangelical truth took the deepest hold, as in primitive times, and produced the fervent Christians of succeeding centuries, such as no other country has produced. In no country was the Reformation, as established by Edward VI and Elizabeth, so complete and so permanent, unless Scotland and Switzerland be excepted. The glory of this radical reform must be ascribed to the humble and persecuted followers of Wyclif, who proved themselves martyrs and witnesses, faithful unto death, more than to any of the great lights which adorned the most brilliant period of English history. Authorities. The works of Wyclif, as edited by F.D. Matthew. The Life and Sufferings of Wyclif, by I. Lewis, Oxford, 1820. Life of Wyclif, by Charles Wylebos, 1846. John de Wyclif, a monograph, by Robert Vaughan, D.D., London, 1853. Turner's History of England should be compared with Lingard. Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History. Neander's Church History. Wordsworth's Ecclesiastical Biography. Geisler, Milner, and General Historians of the Church. Geiky's English Reformation. A German Life of Wyclif, by Dr. Leckler, it is often quoted by Matthew, and has been fortunately translated into English. There is also a slight notice of Wyclif by Fisher in his History of the Reformation. The name of the English reformer is spelled differently by different historians, as Wiclif, Wyclif, Wycliffe, Wyckliffe, but I have selected the latest authority upon the subject, F.D. Matthew. End of section 23. End of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, by John Lord.